Dear students, today we are going to discuss the WTO agreement on agriculture, and this is very important. This agreement was one of the contentious agreement which was concluded in the Uruguay round of negotiations. And why it is contentious? We saw the provisions as well as the problems which they are faced by the countries immediately after the Second World War. So, these discussions are continued during the entire negotiating period of GATT, in the in Kennedy round of negotiations, in Tokyo round of negotiations, and finally, the Uruguay round of negotiations, and some kind of consensus which was came only during the Uruguay round of negotiations. So, we will see what are the WTO agreement on agriculture, what are the components, the bedrock of this particular agreement, and which includes the market access, domestic support, and export competition, the three the pillars of the WTO agriculture agreement. So, when we start talking about the agriculture agreement, and we know that it applies to all agriculture products. So, in the first class we saw that there are so many agriculture products, whether it is cereals or it is millets or it is oil or it is egg or it is meat or meat and meat product, etc. So, these agriculture products are specifically defined in annexure 1 of the agriculture agreement. So, this definition of will go to the harmonized system of product classification. So, it is the UN classification of products, so that the customs valuation authorities can easily put the HS codes, that is the harmonized system of product classification. So, that all over the world these products have the same HS codes or the harmonized system which is developed by individual countries. So, whenever you export a particular product now, it must have a HS code based on the agriculture agreement of the WTO, and these HS codes are developed by different countries on different modes, but there is a common system of HS code classification of products. It means that every WTO member can identify this particular product with a product classification number. So, the definition of agriculture products. So, it is not only covering the basic products. For example, our perception of agriculture product is it is wheat, rice, milk, and other products, or whether it is oil, meat, egg, etc. And also it includes agriculture value added products like chocolate, yogurt, sausages, and now we saw that some of the figures which shows that the most of the food trade is on value added products. So, these value added products are also come under the definition of agriculture. More importantly, you can see that wines and spirits, tobacco products, fibers such as the cotton, wool, silk, etc., and then some of the raw materials like animal skins, which is mostly the produced leather products are produced. These are also included under the definition of agriculture. So, the definition of agriculture is the wide and includes many products. And what is the objective of this particular agriculture agreement, the agreement on agriculture? So, it is a single objective which says that it is to reform the agriculture markets and want to improve the predictability and security for importing and exporting countries. So, the commitments are specific to three pillars of agriculture agreement, and first the market access. So, market access includes removal of all trade restrictions, reduction of domestic support. So, domestic support we talk about mainly the subsidies and other elite programs which are affecting the prices of farmers' production. and the third pillar is export subsidies. So, we will see that what the agriculture agreement talks about these three pillars: market access, domestic support and export subsidies. So, these are not blanketly prohibited, but the agreement says that this is to be reduced, and it is very clear these three areas are considered to be the pillars. Why? Because the main commitments are under these three pillars, and which includes the market access, domestic support and export competition. All these are connected, and you cannot separate it one component. So, that is why the commitments are in all three components. So, what are those commitments? We will see in detail. So, every WTO member country wants to protect their domestic markets. So, that is why they are not ready to open up, they are not ready to open up their markets, including India or it is China. And even though the developed countries say that yes, it is opened up, but our the competitiveness with regard to the developed countries are highly questionable. So, market access definitely refers to elimination of all non-tariff barriers, from the market, and now only allowed is tariffication. That means that the earlier prices, the previous prices were 75% and the world prices higher than the world prices. Now, the new tariff will be 75% tariffication according to the base period. So, all the non-tariff barriers are converted into tariffs based on the base period. That was one agreement on market access. So, tariffication is done, and then removal of various measures which are known as non-tariff measures. This non-tariff measures includes quantitative restrictions, variable import levies, minimum import prices, discretionary import licensing, voluntary import restraints. All these are non-tariff measures, and the members agreed to remove all these by tariffs. So, the tariffication will be done, and also eliminate all non-tariff measures. Elimination of non-tariff measures are very important, and the tariffication should be done, and it is based on the base period. So, the market access, it is very clear, you remove all barriers in terms of quantity, all barriers in terms of taxes, all barriers in terms of licensing, and all barriers in terms of other restraints. So, market access should be given on agricultural products, and also we can see that Article 4(2) of the Agreement on Agriculture very clearly says, members shall not maintain or resort to or revert to any measures of the kind which have been required to be converted into ordinary customs duties. So, all tariff rates are converted into bound rates, reduced rates, or ceiling binding rates, and the special treatment is allowed only on continuation of quantitative restrictions in case of certain conditions, limited use. So, QRs are allowed only in certain conditions, and one such condition we talked about is balance of payment problems. So, Article 4 is very clearly says that members shall not maintain. The language is shall, which is mandatory in nature. So, it is a hard law, every members to remove any kind of non-tariff measures they cannot keep, all it to be converted into tariffs. And then you can see that what was the tariff, these every members agreed. So, the developed countries are agreed for a rate and developing countries are agreed for another rate. So, starting from 1995, the developed countries are agreed that within next 6 years they will reduce the tariff to some extent, and the developing countries are given 10 years. Developing countries are given 10 years transition period to reduce the tariffs. So, if we look into the what is these tariffs, we can see the average cut for all agriculture products by 36% by the developed countries, and at the same time developing countries are also obligated to reduce the tariffs by 24%, even though they got a 10-year period and developed countries only got a 6-year period. Remember, this even for developing countries, this transition period are completed in 2004, 1995 to 2004. All these are over, all these transition period are over by 2004 last, that means up to 2005. Then minimum cut per product, it is very important. Minimum cut per product for developed countries it is 15% and developing countries it is 10%. There is no much changes per product. And total aggregate measurement of support, and the base period is taken 1986-88 period, because the Uruguay round started in 1986. Total aggregate measurement of support. So, developed countries agreed to reduce by 20%, and at the same time the developing countries are also asked to reduce by 13%. Then all export subsidies. So, we already said that export subsidies are one of the considered to be one of the trade distorting measures, and the export developed countries were asked to reduce by 36% and developing countries were asked to reduce by 24%. Then quantities, subsidized quantities by 21% by the developed countries and 14% by developing countries. So, all these obligations are implemented by 164 member countries. So, your basic agriculture product prices at least the developing countries are reduced by 24% when they committed to the WTO in 1995. So, I would say that from a part of developing countries these are huge drastic cut. Average tariff cut 24% is a huge tariff cut, and when they first time they did maybe for the last 50 years. So, these were the huge cutting, whether it is 24% or it is product wise it is 10% or it is aggregate measurement of support also, and then subsidies, reducing subsidies also, all these are a huge cut from the part of the countries. So, the support to the agriculture sector is substantially reduced in case of developing countries. At the same time, you can see that the developed countries are also the difference between these two, you can see that. For example, the total cut, the average cut 36% and 24%, there is only 12% difference between developed countries and developing countries. So, if you take a developed country like US, they are going to reduce 36%. At the same time, you take a poor countries like Pakistan and they have to reduce by 24%. So, the margin is very thin, which is probably not noticed by the analyst. So, the margin of the between developed and developing countries were very less. So, we can see that what is this tariffication, what is this tariff, and what do you mean by this tariffication. So, the agriculture agreement defines what is the tariff. tariff can be any kind of tax. So, tariff is considered to be a trade barrier that takes the form of government as a tax and imposed on goods, right, and sometimes on imports and sometimes even on exports whenever they cross borders. So, basically the governments impose tax on goods when crossing the borders, that is a tariff. So, whether it is imposed by the importing country or it is imposed by the exporting country, does not matter, it is a tariff. And what is the tariff rate quota? Tariff rate quota is, there is a particular quantity of exports or imports which have a lower tariff plan, and this lower tariff plan is only applied to that particular quantity of imports, and beyond that quantity the country impose a higher tax, a higher tariff. So, this lower tariff place, lower tariff quantity is known as a tariff rate quota. And what they said, the WTO agreement says, we already said that all non-tariff measures to be tariffied, all non-tariff protection should be tariffied equivalent to tariff equivalent. So, based on 86-88 period. So, we already said that if 75% was the non-tariff barrier at that point of time, when you tariffied it, 75% is the tax. So, the tariffication is done and the non-tariff barriers are removed. So, it is for explaining. So, you can see this, what do you mean by exactly a tariff rate quota. Here 10% tariff rate quota is charged only 10%. So, that means for a particular quota is 1000 tons, it is only 10% of tax, that is the quota limit. Beyond 10%, and the countries charge 80%, remember 8 times more tax on agriculture products. So, this 10% margin is known as tariff rate quota, and beyond a higher quantity, and this also agreed in WTO, even though as we said that tariff rate quotas are completely removed, but in agriculture because of the special circumstances of the agriculture sector, this is also agreed upon, tariff rate quotas. And then quantitative restrictions, article 4 which we already talked about, article 4 talks about converting tariffs, converting these non-tariff measures into tariffs. For example, quantitative restrictions, minimum import prices, variable import levies, discretionary import licensing, there is no more license Raj, voluntary export restraints, and the only import non-tariff measures maintained by the state trading enterprises. For example, in India, countries like India and other places, state enterprises are only allowed to import certain products, that is also to be removed. All these are considered to be non-tariff measures which has to be removed in the new agriculture agreement. Then comes, so we were talking, so far we are talking about the market access. The second pillar is the domestic support, and domestic support we already said that domestic support mostly in the form of subsidies. So, everybody blames the agriculture market is distorted by subsidies. How it is distorted by subsidies? Because through these subsidies, this argument says that the products are highly underpriced. The actual production cost is very high. Because of the subsidies, the product cost is very less, the production cost is less, and the prices are artificially fixed. So, you reduce subsidies. In certain cases, subsidies increases the production, in certain cases for non-production, overproduction, also to reduce the overproduction, subsidies are provided in developed countries, not at least in developing countries. There is no overproduction. So, this arrangement and discipline is to reduce all subsidies. So, there are domestic subsidies, there are export subsidies. So, these subsidies, domestic subsidies are put in different boxes. So, as I said, the objective was not to ban subsidies. Subsidies are an integral part of the entire scheme. No country can stop, no country can say no to the subsidies. So, what they said, you reduce. So, in order to reduce, they put these subsidies under different boxes. So, one is green box, which is permitted subsidies, amber block. So, this amber box is slowed down or to be reduced, and there is a red box which is forbidden, and blue box possibly trade distorting, but it is permitted maybe for a time period of time. And if this particular subsidy is related to production limitation programs, then the blue box it is to be reduced. So, as I told know that, so the agriculture agreement has no red box. So, the domestic support, the domestic subsidies support the reduction commitment levels. So, the amber box beyond this particular levels is prohibited, but there is no red box. So, we will see these what is these boxes. So, that means it is these subsidies are divided into different boxes, and these boxes have reduction commitments are different. So, we already the presumption is that these domestic supports are trade distorting, and this is to be reduced. So, it is to be certain the categories of support. One is exempted categories and the other one is non exempted categories. So, that means this all the subsidies will be under this rule based system, and we already said that these distorting subsidies are put in blue box and amber box, and non distorting subsidies are put in the green box, which are permitted subsidies. So, that means blue box you require disciplines, reduction commitments, and also in certain cases it is considered to be distorting if it is directly connected with the production stoppages. So, subsidies are of different kinds which will be put in different boxes, and their commitments are different. So, these and also we can see that for example, in the case of the developing countries certain exemptions for developing countries, which are mostly known as S&D box, that is a special and differential box, which is provided in Article 6(2) of the agriculture agreement. So, developed countries reduced 20% over 6 years, and at the developing countries the same reduction is 13% over 10 years. And for example, the commitments for certain commitments like fertilizer subsidy is hiked by many countries. So, the amounts are very large, 70,000 crores. So, 70,000 crores rupees for India is not a small amount. It is the government of India provided 70,000 crores as fertilizer subsidy in the year 1819, and also you can see that more than 1,40,281 crores and 1 lakh, and again. So, you can see that. So, even though the government has earmarked 1,69,000 crores for food subsidy, we talk about our next class about the food subsidies and food security. Food subsidy is one of the largest subsidy provided by the government of India in India, right. So, it is no government can stop this subsidy, food subsidies, subsidized food distributed through the public distribution system, 1,69,323 crores. and actually spent 1,40,000 crores. So, this is the one single head of largest subsidy provided by India for the food distribution system, not for the agriculture sector as such. So, this is the level of subsidy, but the developed countries say that you must put this also, these food subsidies provided also put it under agriculture subsidies. So, again the logical reasoning is differs for developed and developing countries. Food subsidies, agriculture subsidies. So, the developed country says that these food subsidies should be included under the WTO agriculture agreement as well. And then it comes to article 6 talks about the amber box. So, amber box distort production and trade. So, which includes that support prices, subsidies directly relating to production quantities, and also it is not prohibited, but only reduction commitments. And this is amber box, maximum level of supports are committed to the WTO. So, article 6 talks about amber box. Amber box is not prohibited, but reduction commitments are taken from members. So, and amber box, which you can see that, so this is considered to be distort the trade. Amber box is considered to be the whatever the subsidies in the amber box, it is considered to be trade distorting. So, green subsidies, other than green subsidies, amber box and blue box considered to be distorting. So, it may be support prices, subsidies directly connected to the production quantities. So, we said that amber box is considered to be distorting production. Then comes the blue box. So, it is nothing but the amber box with conditions, and blue box subsidies are permitted, but it is nothing but amber box with certain conditions. So, this blue box, so which requires farmers to limit production, but we are not heard this about in developing countries, but developed countries this is very common practice. So, to stop or limit the production. So, blue box, and then blue box subsidies, which we can see that there is no limits on spending the blue box subsidies. So, the negotiations are going on blue box, and then it is and some of the boxes I would say that even though the some of these countries if find out to be trade distorting, then immediately it will be transferred from amber box to blue box, and none of the countries or most of the countries are not want to take the reduction commitments. So, when we closely look into the blue box and amber box, and we cannot find much difference between this amber box and blue box. So, because the payments directly paid from the government budget, most of the subsidies are paid from the government of India budget, production limiting requirements, then payments based on fixed areas and yields, livestock payments, all this will come under the blue box, but blue box subsidies are not prohibited. So, but this is very specifically applicable to certain governmental programs. For example, Government of India gives lot of subsidies to for rural development, that will be come under the blue box. So, de minimis level is not considered the products, for example, 5% or less for developing countries, 10% or less for developing countries, and 5% or less for developed countries. So, 10% is considered as de minimis level, and mostly the government says that most of their subsidies are in the de minimis level, but when it comes to the food subsidies, these are very huge amounts. Now, it comes the third box, that is the green box. Green box as a traffic light green. So, it is permitted subsidies, which is considered to be non trade distorting, or you can say that it is minimal distortion. So, it has to be funded by the government, not by charging consumers, and must not that directly does not or must not involve price support. Then it will be green subsidies. For example, all the subsidies provided for R&D. So, R&D is green subsidy, and then governmental services, research, disease control, infrastructure, food security, all includes payments directly to farmers that do not stimulate production. I do not know which subsidy is not stimulating production. So, the main objective of providing subsidy itself is to stimulate directly or indirectly to stimulate production. So, direct income support and restructuring of agriculture, and then certain environmental and regional assistance programs. All these are green subsidies. These are also subsidies, but green subsidies, permitted subsidies. And for example, the government of India spent a lot of money on Indian Council of Agriculture. All these monies are considered to be under the green box subsidies. So, otherwise also, and we do not know what is the connection between trade and research. So, they are saying that if you give more money to research, that also will come under the subsidies, WTO agriculture subsidies. I find no justification for including this kind of heads under the green box subsidies. Then comes the third pillar. The third pillar is considered to be export subsidies. So, the export subsidies are considered to be trade distorting, and there is a commitment to reduce by developed countries and developing countries, and the commitment was during the 1995 was to reduce 36% by over a period of 6 years by the developed countries and 24% by 10 years. So, all developed countries and developing countries are reduced already, and also the quantities of subsidized exports, quantities of export, the quantities exporting subsidized quantities, developed countries agreed for 21% and developing countries agreed for 14%, and least developed countries no commitments. So, the implementation period is completely over, and for the developed countries as well as the developing countries, and now they are complied with these exporting subsidies. And export subsidies includes a series of subsidies can be included under the export subsidies. So, this relating to export performance, which includes cash payments, disposal of government stocks at below market prices, subsidies financed by producers or processors as a result of government action, marketing subsidies, transportation and freight subsidies, subsidies for commodities contingent on their incorporation exported products. So, all these come under the head of export subsidies. So, these subsidies are considered to be trade distorting, and they have to be reduced. So, the question is discussed by the WTO dispute settlement body, what you exactly mean by subsidy in Canada dairy case. So, the WTO appellate body defined what exactly you mean by subsidies under the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement with related to the agriculture agreement. So, the appellate body said that this definition in subsidies and countervailing measures is applicable to agriculture agreement. And what is this definition of subsidy? The subsidies and countervailing measures agreement defines subsidy as a financial contribution which confers a benefit on the recipient as compared with what would have been otherwise available to the recipient in the marketplace. So, any kind of financial contribution by the government or any kind of financial contribution which have a benefit on the recipient, then it will be considered as subsidy. If you strictly go with article 1(1) of these subsidies and countervailing measures agreement, then all the monies, all the supports by the government to the farmers will come under the definition of subsidy. Nothing can be escaped from this particular definition. So, this is the definition which is confirmed by the appellate body in Canada Dairy Report case. We will come to the definition of aggregate measurement of support. What do you consider as aggregate measurement of support? Aggregate measurement of support is the committed level of annual level of support by every country in terms of monetary terms. So, it means that the government declares product wise, non product specific support to the agriculture sector and exempted, other than exempted reductions. The government says that this is our full support, annual support expressed in monetary terms. This annual measurement of support is committed, fixed by every country to the WTO. So, every member country has to report their aggregate measurement of support to the WTO every year. So, it means that the government, every government declares that what is their subsidy, what is their subsidy budget on agriculture. So, this should not exceed the aggregate measurement of support. So, it means that if you have lot of money, you can give lot of support within the aggregate measurement of support agreed to the WTO. If you do not have the money, for example, the government of India says that our commitment is very high, but we do not have the money to provide subsidies to our farmers. But still the US and other countries blame government of India for giving a higher subsidy, especially in the food security, that is the which is related to the public distribution system. The government of India argues that the subsidies provided to the public distribution system for storage and distribution of food to the poor people, it will not come under the definition. So, this the argument between the West and the South, I mean the developed countries and developed countries, will continue. Even the US threatened that we will take India to the WTO dispute settlement system for providing subsidies to the food sector, and food subsidies we saw that one of the highest subsidy provided by the government of India. And so, it is very simple, the AMS is aggregate measurement of support have two parts. So, specific subsidies and non-specific subsidies, or product specific subsidies and non-product specific subsidies. So, the product specific subsidies are the total level of support is individual agricultural commodity. So, for example, individual specific support to wheat, specific individual support to rice, specific individual support to any other product, and non-specific subsidies, non-specific product subsidies, which includes inputs, input subsidies, fertilizer, electricity, irrigation, credit limits, seed. So, these all will come under the non-product specific subsidy. These non-product specific subsidies to all crops. So, this also, for example, the government provides the one of the largest subsidies, fertilizer subsidy. Every state there is electricity subsidy for irrigation. Then credit facilities. If you include all these in the subsidy, then most of the countries will exceed their AMS. Then again, as I told you, there is a commitment, product reduction of product specific and non-product specific subsidies. So, the non-product specific subsidies does not qualify for exemption, that has to be reduced by 20% by the developed countries and 13.3% by the developing countries. So, the implementation period is over and the countries are implemented this particular provision. So, the total cost of the government on subsidies are expressed in terms of aggregate measurement of support. So, what you will include, what you won't include, it will depend upon every countries, but that should be according to the agriculture agreement. That is the controversy is going on. Can you put these food subsidies within the total AMS? So, according to the definition of subsidies and countervailing measures, definitely it will come under the purview of subsidies. So, even though the government of India passed a specific legislation to exempt the Food Security Act to specifically exclude. So, the developed country says that your Food Security Act itself is against the agriculture agreement. So, this argument of developed versus developing is going to be never ending. Even after 25 or 26 years of the constitution of or 28 years of constitution of the WTO, this argument is going on. So, the total argument, so total measurement of support is the sum total of all domestic support provided to favor of agriculture producers, calculated as sum of all AMS and equivalent measurement of support for agriculture products. So, AMS and EMS, equivalent measurement of support. So, aggregate measurement of support is the total amount which can be spent by any government for the agriculture sector per year. So, the China US dispute is very recent in 2019. So, the agriculture agreement says 8.5% de minimis level for total value of agriculture production and it is 10% for developing countries. So, even though it is 10% for developing countries, so the panel WTO dispute settlement panel found that the China has breached its de minimis level and acted inconsistently with agreement on agriculture. So, I said in the very beginning that agriculture is a very sensitive issue in every country, whether it is India or it is China, does not matter, or even United States, because every country want to feed its population, especially the countries, two countries with the highest number of populations, India and China. So, I am very sure that if the judgment against China is this, the judgment against India is going to be the same, it follows. So, the agriculture is the strict implementation of agriculture is going to be a problem, and the green box exemptions can be very less. For example, see actionable subsidies and non actionable subsidies, some kind of supports, financial limitations. So, for example, support must be provided through a publicly funded government program, not involving a transfer from consumers. So, support may not have the effect of providing price support to the producers. So, the MSP program of India. So, India have MSP program for wheat, rice, so many products. So, all these are going to be within the AMS, there is no exception to the green box. So, all these are the problematic areas to discuss, and why there is the area is still peaceful, because of article 13 of the agriculture agreement, which is known as the peace clause. Because the WTO agreement says that the agriculture disputes will be raised in exceptional circumstances, and certain category of cases we will take due restraint, especially in the subsidies, countervailing duty rights cases. So, and also they will look into due restraint, this is the language which is used under article 13. So, and also setting limits in terms of applicability of nullification or impairment actions. So, the members discussed that this provision will be applicable for 9 years, that means up to December 31st, 2003, and from January 2004 this peace clause is expired. 2004, we are talking about 2004. So, for maybe for more than 14 years, 13-14 years, or it is going to be not 2004 to 2024, we are going to be 19 years. From time to time, all ministerial conferences, this peace clause provision has been extended. So, that means the peace clause expired in 2003, 2004, we are almost 19 years. So, 2004 to 2000, almost 19 years, we are going to 20 years, and the peace clause is extended. Otherwise, there would have been hundreds of cases filed against member countries on all subsidies, all kind of subsidies, whether it is blue box or it is all other kind of WTO, and there is limited number of cases are filed against members mainly because of this peace clause. Otherwise, the WTO have been flooded with agriculture cases, and even agriculture is a discussion topic in all the ministerial conferences, including the Nairobi package, which was discussed in 2015. So, agriculture will come for discussion in every ministerial conferences. What the Nairobi package? The Nairobi package has given certain concessions to cotton producing countries, cotton relating to least developed countries. So, this include the export subsidies, commitment to abolish export subsidies for farm exports. So, you can see that they said that it is the most significant outcome in agriculture, but I do not think that this is the most most significant outcome. It is only one decision. Within a period of 20 years, they have taken a decision to include commitments to abolish export subsidies for farm exports, especially relating to cotton and other areas. And then public stockholding, agriculture decision with regard to public stockholding. For example, the Indian government, the Food Corporation of India, and whatever the activities of the Food Corporation of India is will come under the definition of public stockholding, and this is only for food security purposes. So, the developing countries argued for a special mechanism for developing countries for food security purposes and relating to cotton, and also they argued for a preferential treatment for least developed countries, because least developed countries are still, even though the WTO it is continued all the concessions of WTO up to 28 years, there is no substantial trade between least developed countries. So, they argued for these decisions with regard to preferential treatment for LDs in the area of services. It means that service within the service agreement, the GATS, this preferential treatment should be given in the service sector for the least developed countries. So, even though 2015 Nairobi decisions are towards towards positive impact on reducing these subsidies, but these are only some of the very minimal steps. And also, for example, the commitment to reduce or eliminate subsidies, I am very sure that. So, WTO whatever the extent it is, they are going to discuss about eliminating export subsidies. It is not going to happen neither in developed countries nor in developing countries. So, the commitment was to remove export subsidies immediately by 2018. So, we are in another 5 more years. So, and also the flexibility is the transporting cost. They said that agriculture export we will allow up to 2023. So, we are in 2023 at the end, and this is applicable only to poorest and food importing countries. They will enjoy additional cut to export subsidies. But really whether it is happened or not, it is not happened. So, it means that the Nairobi decision has taken some important steps to reduce subsidies, farm subsidies, but actually whether it is happened or not, again they have to discuss in the next ministerial conferences, which is going to happen in 2024, or whether they have changed from one box to the other box. Practically, actually it is going to happen that only. The countries will be removing the subsidies from one box to the other box rather than eliminating subsidies. And comes to, if you look into the 2013 ministerial conferences and give some more concessions to stockpile the stockpile programs, food stockpile programs. So, as there is a lot of discussion in the 11th ministerial conference in 2017, which talks about the food security concerns. So, India and other developing countries are always raising this point of food security concerns, and they asked for a special safeguard mechanism for developing countries, especially with regard to food security measures. But this problem is, as of today, it is not solved. So, the cotton decisions, many times the ministerial conference has taken decisions in favor of cotton manufacturing countries, and cotton manufacturing countries, we know that it is most of the LDCs, including some of the countries from Africa and including India, cotton producing countries. So, certain concessions are allowed and subsidies are also permitted. And food security issues, when it comes, as I told you, a countries like India. So, you can see all over the world, the most of the people get their basic food quantities through public distribution systems. So, if you take India, the government says that 840 million people get subsidized food through the public distribution system. So, if you take the world together, 195 million people living with hunger, and this is including 38.4% children and 53% women. So, you see the numbers are alarming. All these are the Food and Agriculture Organization numbers. So, 53% of the women in the reproductive age are anemic. So, food security concerns of developing countries are very important. So, you can see that the number of farmers committed suicide in India. So, it says that 3,33,000 farmers are committed suicide in India. So, some countries argue that this is mainly because of this WTO policies, but as a trade lawyer, definitely I will argue that the WTO only contributed to the sufferings of the poor farmers, because this is not because of the case that the government of India is not providing subsidies. So, the figures shows that the government is providing enough subsidies, and if the government have the money, they can give more money to the farmers within the total AMS, because our commitment levels are very high. So, if 3,33,000 farmers are committed suicide, it may not be only due to the WTO. You cannot blame the WTO for this. This is local policies, and the WTO agriculture agreement is only contributed, because still the agriculture market is not opened up in India. So, if the farmer suicides are 3,33,000 without opening the market, then you can imagine what will be the numbers once the agriculture market is open. So, in this class we discussed about the three pillars of the agriculture agreement, and one is market access, second is the domestic support, and third is the export subsidies. And also we talk about what you mean by the aggregate measurement of support, the total aggregate measurement of support. So, these are the basic pillars of the WTO agriculture agreement, and also the scheme of agriculture agreement to reduce tariff levels at developing countries as well as developed countries, and also its consequences. What are the consequences? So, the WTO agreement gives, agriculture agreement gives only basic minimum level of the reductions of or commitments, reduction commitments under the 3 heads. One is the market access, and the second one is the subsidies commitments, and third one is the export subsidies. So, these are the minimum level of commitments, every members are implemented it. So, whether your country is benefited or not benefited, it is a discussion point. So, in the next class we will discuss about the food security concerns of developing countries. Specifically, I would like to emphasize on India. Thank you.